Morning, Abotai. Yesterday we started speaking about some of the halachot of Shehiya on Shabbat. Shehiya is leaving a pot of food on an open flame in a way that it continues to cook on Shabbat. The Chachamim were sometimes concerned that that would lead to Shema Yechateh B'Kichalim, lest the person stoke the coals. Now, there are two things that a person can do either or in order to permit leaving a food on a fire to continue cooking as Shabbat begins. One we call tikkun ha'esh, which means fixing or doing something to improve the fire, and one is called tikkun ha'ma'achal. One is called fixing the food, doing something to the food. Today we'll talk about fixing the fire. What does that mean? The Chachamim said that what you can do is, you can do something called garuf vekatum. In those times, they used to have stoves like we have today. They used to have something called a kira. It was also a stove, quote unquote. It was like a box that had a hole in the middle of it that you could put pots inside, and two holes on the top that you can hang pots into. It was filled with coals. Now the Chachamim said in order to leave the pot of food in there to cook as Shabbat begins, you have to do one of two things. Either garuf, which means to scoop out all the coals, so only the residual heat stays in there, but you can't stoke it because there's no coals, or katum. Katum means to keep the coals in there, but to cover it with a layer of ash. That layer of ash, what it did was two things. Number one, it created a hekir, some sort of recognition that, hey, wait a second, today's Shabbat, not to come stoke. We're not talking about Rishayim, we're talking about a person subconsciously. So that created a recognition, number one. Number two, the ash lowered the intensity of the heat of those coals. So today, obviously, we can't do gerifa anymore. There's nothing to scoop out because we don't have coals. By the way, I should point out that although we don't have, our stoves don't have coals to stoke anymore, nevertheless, all of the poskim of our times hold that a stove nowadays, a gas stove, is considered just like the coals in the times of Chazal, in that you can't just leave on it regular, even though there's no stoking. Because at the end of the day, you could still make the heat higher by turning the knob. So you have to do something. Hence, you can't scoop out the coals. What you can't do is katum, which means what? You can cover the fire. How do you cover the fire? Which is what everybody knows. This is what we know as a blech. You take a metal sheet, an aluminum sheet, and that covers the fire. That creates the same thing as covering the coals with ash. It covers it so you remember it's Shabbat. And number two, it lowers the heat of the fire for the food that's on top. That's a blech. Or plata chashmalit, an electric hot plate on Shabbat. That in and of itself is considered covered. Why? Because the heat source is inside, the spirals. The heat source is covered with the aluminum sheet on top. The plata itself is considered garuf vekatum. Maran Zichron Lebracha holds, unlike other poskim, that you have to actually put something else on top of the plata. You have to cover with another aluminum sheet or whatever. He says no, you can put directly on the plata. It itself is considered garuf vekatum. But with regards to the gas, it's not enough to cover the knobs of the gas. That's not enough. You have to cover the actual fire. Once you do either that, either a blech or you use a plata, you can leave the food on either one at any level of cooking when Shabbat begins, and it can continue to cook on Shabbat. Tomorrow, Be'ezrat Hashem, we'll speak about what else you can do to allow Shehiya as Shabbat begins. Yom Tov.